All right, thank you all. So I thought we'd start off this conversation with a very basic question, because the book is called The Global Novel, and I think you do a really great job in the introduction of the book describing what the global novel is and also sort of generously giving lots of room to critiques of it before concluding in a fairly hopeful way about what it is. But maybe you could just start by telling us what the global novel is, how you define it for the purposes of this book.
Sure. Well, when you think about how much attention is paid to the idea of the global now and to globalization, it makes sense that the novel would in some way reflect the increasing globalization of culture, technology, lifestyle, and politics, because the novel is the genre that's always reflected the way we live and sort of brought news of what is developing in the way we live. The global novel is a contentious, and as I discovered in sort of researching the book, surprisingly contentious idea. People often talk about world literature rather than global literature, but the idea that world literature comprises a whole of some kind, and that books written in different places in different languages are all part of one conversation can be surprisingly contentious among critics and theorists, and I talk about that in the first chapter of the book, because there are obviously lots of reasons to be skeptical of the idea of a global novel. One is that no one can read all the novels that are being written around the world at any given time. It's impossible logistically and linguistically. So when we talk about world literature, the global novel, we're often talking about a fairly narrow subset, a canon of books that has come to the attention of readers around the world because they have been reviewed, given prizes, translated, and published. And that process is not a transparent one. There are always motivations as to why certain things are rewarded above others. So there are all kinds of points of criticism that can be made about what we receive as world literature, as the global novel. With all those points made, what I argue in the book is that the global novel is a rewarding and useful concept as a way of writing and as a way of reading in particular, and that there are lots of different ways in which the global quality of contemporary civilization and inner life is reflected in the novel. I'd say the global novel isn't one kind of novel, it's not a species, but it is a genus that incorporates lots of different kinds of writing. And I talk about 8 examples in the book, and of course there are many other examples that could be brought under the same rubric.
Okay, so just to follow up on that a little bit, so what is the difference between a novel and a global novel? The way I describe it in the book is that no one's experience is immediately global. That is, no one lives simultaneously everywhere, in every language, in every culture or political entity. So the idea that a novel could be immediately global is out of reach. There's no novel that is simultaneously about everything in the world. What there is a novel that takes seriously the global dimensions of the way we live and think and feel. And that can be various different kinds of things. One obvious example is a novel that is set in many different countries or is about people that cross borders into many different places. And as I mentioned, as we were talking before, a sort of classic archetypal example of that is a book that was published after I wrote mine, that was just published recently, Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. I talk about one of Hamid's other books, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, in my book. But Exit West, which is a book from the last couple of months, is really a book about crossing borders, about refugees, about what it means to relocate under historical pressure from one region of the world to another. It's written in a style that's simultaneously very realistic and also has magical realist elements. In this book, there are doors that magically open from one place to another so that you, instead of having to go across an ocean, you can just open a door and end up in Marin County or on the island of Mykonos or various places that the characters find themselves. So I'd say a global novel is a novel that takes seriously or thematizes or focuses on the global quality of contemporary experience. Okay. So, John, I just wanted to ask you, just throw a question towards you about this, because you're known for, with your journal and other work you've done, for publishing voices from around the world. Does this idea of the global novel, does this make sort of intuitive sense to you, as someone who is exposed to lots of international writing?
Yeah, of course. My approach to it has always been just that the English language and the Anglo-American tradition don't have a kind of monopoly on beauty and interesting themes within writing, and so I've always tried as an editor to look beyond what's obvious and to look for things which are not being presented to me. And I think there are lots of, just as there are lots of obstacles to some people who wish to migrate, there are lots of novel obstacles to novels that wish to migrate. Whether it's, I was just at an event in Berlin Saturday, and a Slovenian translator. I had a panel with a Chinese writer, a Somali writer, a writer from rural Maine, and another writer from Palestine. And we were talking about home, and she was saying, a writer from Slovenia does not find a home in the global literary culture that you are all speaking about right now, simply because no one wants to translate from Slovenian. And so I think there is a global novel, but it has all the obstacles that global culture has, and all the power structures and the barriers, and unfortunately the exploitation.
Mm-hmm. So Laura, let me just throw this question toward you. Do you think that there is then kind of a sense of sort of presumption in ever thinking that we have access to something that can be called sort of a global novel, given all of those limitations John was just talking about?
Well, I think the thing I found really useful about Adam's book was that he didn't seem to be trying to define it, to pin it down in those terms. And I think that, I hope I'm reading this right, but what you do in the book is you say that the global novel is a way of approaching the themes in these books and creating like links between them, so you can discuss Hamid and Ferrante and Pamuk in ways that together that you wouldn't normally do. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's a pretty useful way of understanding the texture of contemporary life when we're hearing so much about globalization and xenophobia, to be able to look at this body of literature, much of which does fit into this category of the best that has been thought and said, at least in recent years, to be able to appreciate the global dimension of that is sort of a politically important project too.
Mm-hmm. So, and why did you choose the 8, in fact, maybe you can tell us about the 8 different novels that your book covers and why you thought that they fit as a cohort?
Well, the subtitle of the book is Writing the World in the 21st Century. So I picked books written or published in the 21st century, which I tried to make geographically diverse. They all had to be naturally accessible to me in English. And they were all books that received a good deal of attention critically and popular readership, and were translated into many languages. So they're books that had a global reception. I'm trying to think of them in order. The first one is Snow by Orhan Pamuk. I write about 1Q84 by Murakami and 2666 by Bolano. I write about Americana, which recently was named the one-read book for New York City, and The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels. I don't know if I left anything out there. Oh, that's right. And Margaret Atwood's Oryx and Crake, and Michel Houellebecq. That's right. And Michel Houellebecq's The Possibility of an Island, which are both novels that, when you think of Atwood and Houellebecq, they're very different writers. They're almost as different as you could imagine, but they converge in these books on themes of genetic engineering and of the future of humanity as a species that are quintessentially global, because they're about the future of humanity on the globe.
And what do you think is the value of the kind of global element in these books?
Well, so there are a couple of different ways of approaching the subject. One, since I was just talking about Atwood and Houellebecq, I'll stick with them. The novel has been, along with other cultural forms, has, in the last several generations, maybe since World War II, lost confidence in speaking about humanity, about a singular humanity. Or one way of putting that is that universalism is something that writers are increasingly uncomfortable with, the idea that any one writer can speak for everyone. Global fiction is one way of sort of regaining that confidence by the back door. When you write about, as these two novels do, about experiments in remaking humanity through genetic engineering and what might result from that, that's a way of writing about what it means to be human and about human nature in a way that is essentially universal, but is sort of justified or reaches the universal through concrete scientific and contemporary political issues. That way of writing still has its hazards, and one thing I say in the book is that Atwood, who's Canadian, and Welbeck, who's French, converge on an idea that contemporary Western civilization is sort of irredeemably bankrupt, and that the sign of this bankruptcy, more than anything else, is male sexuality. That male sexuality has become vicious and violent and exploitative in a way that justifies its abolition. And this is actually a theme in a number of the books that I write about, but in these two in particular. So in Oryx and Crake, the story is about a young sort of crazed genius who engineers a post-human race of creatures that don't reproduce sexually in the same way as human beings, and is designed to eliminate ideas like paternity and the family and private property. And then in the Welbeck novel, The Possibility of an Island, it's about a cult that engineers similarly a post-human species that doesn't live in social forms but lives individually, each person in their own apartment, and most of the world is depopulated with just a few people remaining. What they're both doing is writing about, really, does the human species and the society that it's created deserve to survive? Do they deserve to continue? And the answer that both of those novels give is pretty pessimistic and pretty negative. Both of them suggest that it would be justified in a lot of ways to replace humanity. Now, I think it's significant that those are both Western first world writers, and that what they're really doing is saying, because the forms of sort of late capitalist society that we've evolved in these countries, Canada and France and the United States, have failed, that therefore humanity as a whole has failed, and that humanity deserves to be wiped out. That is a problematic kind of globalism, right? Because it suggests that there is no alternative route for the rest of the world, or that other kinds of development could not redeem the problems of first world society. So there are these moral and political issues inherent in the idea of the global novel, just as there are in the idea of globalism. But I think that they're interesting problems and interesting things to think about.
Right. Do you think that, and I'm just going to throw this open to everyone, do you think that the idea of like a global literature, particularly when we define it as books that are translated into English and that are accessible to American audiences or Anglophone audiences around the world, do you think that the concerns that are sort of elevated by those novels are necessarily going to be the concerns of the West and even elites in the West? Meaning the concerns of basically American book readers and consumers.
Absolutely. I mean, I used to review books quite a bit for newspapers in St. Louis, and I reviewed Snow, for smallish American city newspapers. And it was very hard to find an intro into that book that didn't immediately put it within the paradigm of the rise of exclusively the rise of Islamic extremism within Turkey. And I thought Adam did a very nice job describing that book and what it does in addition to that, and how Orhan Pamuk kind of writes himself and the possibility of global readership into the book and then erases it at the same time. And one of the ideas that Adam toys with throughout this book is translatability, as in how much experience do we have the ability to understand, as in can I, a guy from Sacramento, California, appreciate what it means to be a girl with a headscarf who commits suicide in Turkey because she feels her identity has been impugned? And I think the global novel, as Adam defines it, is an inspiring thing, because it says, yes, absolutely, we can do that. But as an editor, I'm often very interested in the mechanics. And so I also reviewed the Ferranti novels that you write about, but I reviewed them for a Norwegian newspaper. And one of the Norwegian newspapers I write for has a translator that translates English exclusively into New Norwegian, which is a new language which was created by some guy going around the country and putting together all these ways that people were speaking in Norwegian, and then creating a new language that's a little bit different than the sort of Old Norse, which is what Norwegian kind of descends from. And so until that point, the Ferranti novels had never been read in Norway. No one had any idea this was 2 books into the phenomenon. And then it's explained in a language that has a typical flavor. And so already there are several layers of barrier to explaining how robust and alive her use of vernacular is in that language. And when a book can still overcome all those barriers, I feel like maybe that is the quintessence of the global novel. Or maybe it's just fantastic literature, because that's been happening through the ages.
Right. It's interesting also because you have the example of Murakami, which is kind of the opposite of that, where it's not about the richness of the language at all.
Yeah, well, I talk about how there's a sort of standing criticism of Murakami in Japan, and I quote a couple of writers talking about him and his own reaction to this, that his language is, the reason why he's successful worldwide is that his language is very thin and it's stripped for export, and that people who appreciate Japanese literary language think of him as a simplistic writer. And that's a perfect example. I have no way of knowing exactly what that means or judging that as someone who doesn't read Japanese. And there's definitely a danger of creating an English monoculture, right? If English is the world's most common second language, that is effectively the global novel or global literature is what has been translated into English. And there are reasons why, as we've been saying, some things don't get translated into English. So I think it's probably true that the books that appeal to the West are disproportionately about relations with the West in various parts of the world. Now, that said, that is one of the major themes of world politics, right, and of world history. So it's not that it's necessarily an unimportant subject. I think that it is something that gets written about in a variety of ways by people all over the world. And the fact that we have the opportunity to read it, even in translation, I think enriches our understanding of the way the West is seen, the way America is seen by people around the world, which is an important exercise in sort of stepping outside of our parochial point of view.
Do you think that there's a danger, and again, I'm throwing this out to everyone, there's a danger, though, that the books that end up getting translated, and not very many books are, relative to, I guess, the number of books that are published around the world, are translated into English, are going to be the ones that, in fact, flatter American sensibility to some degree, which might have the opposite effect of making us actually less informed about how people think about the West, or giving us some kind of misinformation about how people think about the West. Is that a danger of interpreting these novels as being sort of true reports from the world?
Well, I think the Ferrante books don't really have much to say about us. And she's also a Western novelist. Right. Mm-hmm. So I found I thought an interesting theme that emerges through the book is this idea of the novel of upward mobility just being adapted for a new kind of stage of capitalism. So if we think about the Bildungsroman emerging with Industrial Revolution, this is kind of the update of that for globalized capitalism. And I think that might be a way of reading it that does feel more global, rather than just saying that we're here in New York and looking out at these people commenting on us. Mm-hmm. Because I think, especially from Adam's discussion of the books, often that's not really what the authors are altogether concerned with. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I think of all the writers who came and met, like Haldor Laxness came to the United States and became good friends with Sinclair Lewis, and then got kicked out of the United States because he was hanging out with communists too much. I think of the writer of one of the key tracks of the early rise of Al-Qaeda, who went to university in Colorado. And so there's lots, in addition to the way that books are arrive here and are read here and interpreted here, there are also the actual physical movements of people. And so a precursor to Orhan Pamuk was Yasir Kemal, a Kurdish writer who wrote the beautiful novel Mehmed My Hawk, and was sort of the Turkey's Dickens, except he was Kurdish. And he was friends with James Baldwin, who spent a lot of time in Turkey. He was friends with Arthur Miller. And simultaneously, I think, Mo Yan was influenced by William Faulkner. And so I think the global novel is not just the novel being exported, translated, and turned into a product. There's a actual human network of people that are meeting each other and being influenced by each other, either in person or through works in translation. I'll never forget Yun Li talking about how she had a whole list of books in China when she was growing up that had been translated. It was not just Americans, there was Chekhov and all the Russians. And in that sense, the global novel, I think, is still a hopeful thing. And I think, yes, these barriers exist. And I think often the the warping happens when it comes to the critical aperture and what gets talked about. Because even though, yes, 3% of books are being translated, it's how they're written about. And I'm curious, Laura, in your pages, Adam can unpack all this the cultural significance of what Pamuk is writing about, because he's writing 4,000 and 5,000 word chapters. And I think it must put a section like yours, or think about an even shorter section, under a great deal of strain to try not to simplify the complexity of what a novel is reflecting in its own native culture.
Well, we run pieces that are 3,500 words, so I guess it's like 1,500 words less. So maybe you have a few less examples. One of the points I wanted to pick up on was when you were talking about the monoculture. I think that the whole intrigue around who Elena Ferrante was is really interesting as a way of looking at that, because for a while we thought that she was Domenico Starnone, and then it turns out that she might not be, and she might be his wife. And if you compare like the works of those two authors, how different, could they be? We're not sitting here talking about Domenico Starnone's novel. If any of us are looking at it, it's probably because we thought he might be Elena Ferrante. And I think that if you were to look at two people who are married, who are both writing in Italian, one of them is producing a book that happens to be able to travel throughout the world, and the other is not. They're both working in the same publishing structures. They're both in the same intellectual milieu in Italy. I think that it makes me skeptical that this idea of the global novel creates a monoculture. I think it promotes books that maybe conform to some of those ideals, but I don't think it is having an effect, like a huge effect on vernacular cultures.
One of the arguments that Adam brings up in the beginning was a much noted essay in N+1, which was criticizing the global novel, and it chose Mohsen Hamid and Rushdie and Michael Ondaatje, and then out of nowhere, Kamala Shamsi wound up taking some shots in there. And she has a new novel that's coming out that's set, and it's a transnational novel set in Pakistan, England, and America. And one of the things I was talking to her recently about, I said, did you ever, growing up in Karachi, did you come to the United States and then suddenly the scales fell from your eyes and you stopped believing in American exceptionalism? She said, no, we knew exactly that we shouldn't believe in it because the Americans were supporting Zia-ul-Haq. And in this, in general culture here, that's virtually unknown. And so I think, yes, like there's novels like Ferrante, which can travel brilliantly. And then there are other novels which need a great deal of political footnoting for you to appreciate maybe why they need to exist. And I think that's, in some ways, they can help us learn the footnotes as you read them. That's not the purpose. The novel is beauty, and beauty has no purpose. But still, I think the problem the global novel runs into is that problem of context.
Yeah, and I would say that that's sort of always been a problem for literature. And if we think about books that are as familiar to us as Crime and Punishment or Madame Bovary, there's a lot that we aren't getting about those novels because we aren't familiar with the immediate milieu that they emerge out of. And indeed, even Jane Austen, right? I mean, if you read Jane Austen, there's a huge amount of mores and institutions and manners and things that we don't have instinctive access to anymore. So time, in addition to space, can be a defamiliarizing agent. And in a way, these books become different books when they're translated, and they become different books over time. Walter Benjamin talks about books translation being part of its afterlife, that the publication of the book is just the birth of the book. Then its actual life and afterlife consists of all of the translations and all of the editions and all of the commentary and all of the thought that it provokes. So I think we shouldn't be in quest of a sort of illusory idea of authenticity, right? There is not any way to have a completely authentic reading of most books, and maybe that's true of all books, because all books require some degree of misprision, of misreading, in order to be brought close to the reader. There is no one right way to read the book. There could be more or less right ways, but there's not I don't worry when reading fiction in translation about my own inauthenticity in relation to the text. I feel that I'm gaining what I can gain from it. I think that, in fact, books that get translated or that are written in English and become successful and critically acclaimed in the West, in the United States, are almost never simply praising the United States or the West. They're almost always contending with it in some way. And that's certainly true of Hamid in the books that we've mentioned, in The Reluctant Fundamentalist and Exit West. Right now I'm reading the book called The Sympathizer, which won the Pulitzer Prize last year. And that's an interesting example of how America stands in a maybe unique relationship to the idea of global literature, because we have immigrant communities from around the world as part of American literature, so that the Vietnamese American story is an American story and a global story, the way it's told in that book. It takes place partly in Vietnam, partly in Southern California, and it's about living between those two places. And that's always been an important strand in American literature, is literature of immigration. So in a way, Americans are well positioned, I think, to have access to world literature, at least to different areas of it, if not to all of it simultaneously.
It's interesting. One of the things I thought about when I was reading your book was a lot of sort of conversations and debates that people in African American literature have had for a long time, which is about whether or not, there's a certain kind of novel that is published by a Black writer that is published with a white reader more or less in mind, over the shoulder. Even some of the classics of African American literature, greatest writers like James Baldwin, have been accused of writing with a white audience in mind, and therefore, in whatever ways, inflecting their work toward that reader, rather than writing something that might come from a more authentic place, perhaps, or writing to other Black readers, and so, and thereby kind of excluding Black readers from their art in some ways, or not considering them as part of the audience. Do you feel like with these global writers that you've selected, that they are conscious of audience when they're writing? Are they conscious of, you talk about Roberto Bolano as being someone who was writing at all times with this ambition to be like, he didn't call himself a global novelist necessarily, but a great writer who'd be read everywhere in forever. So
I don't think that serious literary writers consciously write in an expectation of popular success or a demand for popular success. Unconsciously, who knows? One of the books I talk about in the first chapter of my book is a very influential study called The World Republic of Letters by Pascal Casanova, who's a French literary theorist, and it came out about 10, maybe a little more years ago. And she talks about how world literature is a system in which there's a Greenwich Mean Time, and the Greenwich Mean Time runs through Paris, basically. And she's French, so it makes sense that she would think Paris, but there's also good historical argument to be made for that. And that Paris is sort of where the most cutting-edge literary experimentation and thinking happens, and that literature in other parts of the world is on a time lag from the cutting edge. And in order to be validated in Paris, or then she adds in London or New York, it has to insert itself into that time zone. It has to do something to seem modern, to achieve modernity, and that's the kind of thing that allows a book to be translated and to enter the global canon. I think that maybe that is something that writers have in mind, of writing a modern book, writing in an up-to-date way, not wanting to seem provincial or out of date. Not all writers, but I think that might be something that is on the minds of some writers. And that, in a way, is about appealing to a Western audience. Although I'm sure that if you asked any of these writers, are you writing because you want to be read in the United States, they would say, no, I'm writing the book that I want to write. I'm writing the book that I feel needs to be written.
Right, Laura, you made an interesting point about the Ferrante novels, that they, I'll let you make the point, but you were saying how they sort of evolved over time, and it seemed as if the first novel was almost like the inviting gateway before the novels complicated themselves, and maybe there was a conscious effort to create a more universal story at the beginning.
I don't know if there was. My reading of it is just that it's this huge social epic, so it just builds up and becomes more interesting, kind of in the way that the Mort d'Arthur gets more interesting by the 8th installment. It doesn't feel from the stuff I've read by her, like her letters and emails, she was more interested in creating something gripping that would be attractive for the structure of the story rather than the richness of the language. So it felt to me more like a byproduct of that narrative approach, that it gets richer and more detailed as you go through, which I felt like made it more consciously literary, but at the beginning I don't think it is. But I think the reason we were talking about that was because one of the criticisms that's leveled at this idea of the global novel is that it's very bland, and like the Murakami criticism, that it can be just sort of like switched in to different languages and be recognizable to people anywhere in the world. And I think the first Ferrante novel feels more like that. So the first Neapolitan novel, not Days of Abandonment, but the first Neapolitan novel feels like that. And then the following three feel much more specific, just because we've been living with these people for so long, that they become so defined by the different settings that we see them moving through.
That's part of the evolution of, I mean, what's great about the book is it's one of the most fabulous evolutions of consciousness in front of you. And so you begin on the street with, you know, the street-sized view of childhood, and then you move to the university, and then you're in a city, and then you move beyond, you're in Italy, and then you're in the world at a certain period. And it's sort of almost like the novel, which I think is one long novel, just kind of scales outward. And so I think the beginning is deliberately simple, because children do not think in complex sentences. Simultaneously, Murakami's style was a deliberate decision. His one or both of his parents taught Japanese literature, and so it's not an accident that that guy would move to Tokyo and open a jazz bar and have his revelation that he wanted to write a novel at a baseball game, and that when he wrote that novel in Japanese, he wasn't happy with it, and then he took the first few pages, translated it into English, and then translated it back into Japanese, and arrived at the style that we know Murakami to have. And he's written about this. I mean, it's not a secret. And so I think, you know, Murakami at age 29 writing a novel isn't thinking, I'm going to take over the world and get translated into 60 languages. He's just trying to write a style that feels new and fresh to him. And he's a slightly younger generation than Oe and Mishima, who, you know, have implicitly criticized him, you know, for the way that he writes. And if you go to, I don't know, if you go to Japan, you know, that the country was firebombed by the U.S. forces in World War II. It was completely leveled. Everything feels new and slightly strange and slightly dislocated. And so yes, there's a huge, very old tradition of Japanese writing. But I think what Murakami did, which no one else had done before him, was describe that newness and the permeation and the slight, almost excessive permeability to other cultures, because it was a defeated culture. And that's not the only thing that makes Murakami great, is that within a paragraph you are gripped. For some reason, someone's making spaghetti, and it's great. And so I think, you know, the Murakami is to me is a straw man in the global novel discourse, because there's just so many other examples of how the global culture has brought very, very interesting and specific news about other cultures to us, including Ferrante.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just ask one more question before we, I guess, open it to the folks out here. And I think this is I think one of the real questions about the value of the global novel is, you know, this question of, can a novel speak for a group of people, which is something that I think some of these novelists specifically grapple with. And I think it's just also interesting to think about it from the point of view of critics, whether or not, as a critic, when you see a novel coming from some part of the world that you haven't seen a lot of literature from, do you think this novel is now speaking for, in some ways, or, you know, it's difficult to maybe fight the sort of inclination to let the novel speak for a group of people. Is it even possible for a novel speak for a group of people? Or him, going back to him, speaks sort of explicitly about that in Snow.
Yeah. Well, Pamuk, so in Snow, which is a novel that takes place entirely over a couple of days in a very small town in Turkey. So in a sense, it's as unglobal as you can get. It's a remote location and very enclosed.
there's political violence over this period where it's literally snowing very heavily, and so that's what cuts off this town from the outside world. And in the course of the novel, the narrator talks to various people about their views and about their life history, and sort of allows people to talk for themselves. And at the end of the book, he's talking to one character in particular. The narrator is talking to a character and says, "What do you want me to write about you when I write about you for the West, for Germany in particular," is what he's talking about. And the character says, "Just don't write about me at all, because there's absolutely no way that you could write about me in a way that would make other people elsewhere understand." So it's a sort of amazing moment within a novel in which a character who's being allowed to speak for themselves in the novel tells you, "Don't write about me because you won't allow me to speak for myself." It's like the camera looking at itself in some way, or the mirror reflecting each other. And I think that's Pamuk's gesture towards the idea that a novel can't be representative. A novel is not representative, it's individual. It's always the work of one person. And just as you wouldn't expect or someone in Turkey reading Jonathan Franzen to then understand America, one wouldn't expect to understand Turkey from reading one Turkish novelist, or even 10 or 20 Turkish novelists. There's no duty to be representative in writing a novel.
Okay, great. I also think it's just interesting that you mentioned that Americana was selected as the one book, New York, and it was competing against like books that I think were on like sort of a sliding scale away from the global novel, because Americana being a more global novel, then you had I think Oscar Wilde, which is kind of an American but also sort of a Dominican story, and then you had A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which is literally like planted in New York, like the most, and A Tree Grows in Brooklyn like lost in a landslide. So maybe there's something to this global novel. But do you worry sometimes though about losing some of the sort of hyper local observation, you know, that that you get in novelists who don't have that ambition in the sort of, I mean, the novels that you cover are all novels that were award-winning, best-selling, huge, like, almost all of them, successes, and whether or not there's like maybe something that's lost in.
Well, a book that I didn't write about, but in retrospect feel like I could have and sort of regret not including, is a book that I was just teaching to a class of students today, Open City by Teju Cole, which is in a way a very global book. It takes place in Nigeria, America, and Belgium. And it's about one character whose life is lived in all these different places. And that book it's very global in its conceptual reach and in the kinds of references it makes and in the characters who appear in it. But it's also hyper-local in that it's about taking walks in New York City, and there are very, very detailed evocations of particular neighborhoods in New York City, from Chinatown to Morningside Heights to the Cloisters. So I don't think that the two are necessarily at odds. I think that the local can be a sort of gateway into the universal, and that's something that novelists have not had a lot of faith in maybe in the last several generations, and maybe the global novel is a way of regaining that faith.
Excellent. Okay, cool.
We have time for a couple questions. If you want to raise your hand, I'll bring you a microphone. You got one right here.
There's been a lot of talk about contemporary books and contemporary themes. I wonder if you would have anything to say about the global novel more as historical fiction, or speaking, topically into the past.
I think that in my book, I'm focusing on recent books, and I do think that there's a qualitative difference, and it has to do with technology, that that our lives are more globalized now. Certainly there have always been books about immigration. Certainly in American literature, there have always been books about immigration. And there's always been books that take place in one small location and have universal resonance. I think maybe what's new is that the experience of being conscious of what's going on around the world, and of being conscious of facing dangers and challenges that are global in scope, is such a distinctive part of contemporary experience. I don't talk in the book, but could have talked about, say, environmentalism and climate change as a global theme that by its very nature is about more than one place. So I think that as our experience becomes more global, the novel evolves in that direction naturally. And one thing that we haven't talked about much tonight, but I'd be interested to hear people's takes on, is that now that we're entering this moment when we seem to be deglobalizing in an alarming way, and national borders are becoming more significant rather than less, as they have seemed over the last generation, that the global novel might even become more important because it gives you a window through the wall, right? As if we're raising walls between countries, it allows you to see the humanity of people who appear in political discourse in dehumanized ways.
My feeling about that is a lot of the nationalist movements within countries are propped up by money or foreign influence from outside. I mean, would Trump have gotten elected without whatever happened that we don't know happened? Marie Le Pen is being supported from outside forces. The Dutch candidate who lost was being supported by American right-wingers. And so I sometimes look at the discourse of nationalization as something that's been, it's like a small percentage of a population, but someone is just pouring gasoline on it. And so I get quite frustrated when we have to sort of, I think it's a completely valid point, but I get frustrated we have to filter through that kind of argument because most people, who migrate for a better, to make their children's lives better, or they're migrating because they have to. And so I think a lot of people in many ways just simply support that. And when it comes to the novel and literature, to me, it feels like migration was at the very beginning of, it's in Gilgamesh. It's the original novel, original book is a migration book. And ever since then, I feel like it's been a part of literature. And so I think right now what we're going through is unfortunate, but I do feel like it's not representative, if you will, of the way that people by majority feel.
I think there's also a danger that there is an illiberal version of the global novel. I wouldn't say Submission is a great, it's a global novel, right? But it's probably not a bulwark against Marine Le Pen. But that seemed like a real outlier, those kinds of novels, especially in your book, but even when I was trying to think of others, it seems like an overwhelmingly liberal phenomenon, but there's a danger that it could be co-opted.
Yeah, sure. I think that we're used to the idea that writers are sort of innately cosmopolitan and liberal, and that's not always true, and it's historically not true at all. It's true in the last 100 years, but it's not necessarily true before that, and not for everyone in the last 100 years either. So you could definitely imagine a novel of globalization that is very anti, right? That is very defensive and negative about globalization. Submission, the Welbeck novel, which imagines a sort of Islamic takeover of France, is a good example of a novel that looks on globalization as a threat. Although it's also got a lot of sort of internal criticisms of French society that make it more directed towards a French audience than a global audience.
I'll try to come over there and then I'll come back here.
How would the reverse of what you've just been talking about fit into this paradigm? I notice none of you have brought up colonialism, where languages, especially French and English, were exported around the world and then reappropriated by writers in, say, Nigeria or India who are writing in English, or writers in Morocco who are writing in Morocco and then being read in France. And that complicates their relationship to their audience. These are global novels by default, but I'm not sure how they would fit within the paradigm that you're describing.
Yeah, I think that the global novel definitely overlaps with what used to be called, and maybe still is called, postcolonial literature, that they present that those two things are two ways of talking about Western cultural dominance and hegemony, right? That, like the Casanova thing that I mentioned, the idea that the meridian runs through Paris or London, and that's where judgments are made and tastes are set. And that applies, interestingly, to places where there is a legacy of Western colonialism, and also to places where there isn't. There's a Japanese writer called Mine Mizumura who wrote a book called The Decline of Language in the Age of English, which I talk about a little bit. And she talks about how in Japan, the rise of English as a second language has, or she believes, threatens to eliminate the idea of Japanese literature or of national literature in general. And she points out that historically, it hasn't always been the case, or even usually, that literacy is the same as the vernacular language, that for a long time in Europe, all literacy was in Latin, no matter what language you spoke. And she talks about how in Japan, literacy was in Chinese, no matter what language you spoke. And so there is this possibility of displacement, right? But then, as you say, there's this also a possibility of reappropriation. And the book I think of, the recent book I think of, is the Meursault investigation by Kamel Daoud, in which he takes the story of L'Étranger, the Camus novel, and rewrites it from the point of view of the person who's referred to only as the Arab in the French novel. So I think that while this dominance of English is a historically rooted phenomenon and it's rooted in colonialism, it doesn't necessarily make impossible an exchange through that medium, right? That language can still be a medium of exchange.
So we have time for one last question back here.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, thanks. I wanted to ask about universalism. I think you said that the universalism, or the claim to universalism, sort of fell out of favor in the wake of the Second World War, which sort of might seem paradoxical in light of the recognition of universal human rights and so on. But my question, how would you chart the trajectory of universalism since the Second World War, and what impact, how do you think that's shaped the global novel since then?
That's a really big question that I don't know if I can answer in the right scope here, but I think that the idea of the Enlightenment fell into disrepute after the Second World War, and that much, certainly Western critical theory in the 50s and 60s and 70s was critical of the idea of the Enlightenment, or of a unitary human nature that's independent of historical circumstance or of historical roots. I mean, existentialism is sort of the beginning of that, and it has a legacy in postcolonialism as well. And the idea that in writing a story that takes place in one place, you're writing something that's of interest and applicable to people in all places is really at the heart of literature in a basic way. And so my feeling has always been that literature is necessarily a humanistic enterprise, that as soon as you're writing a novel, you're doing something humanistic, even if you are mistrustful of humanism as an ideology. And the global novel might be a way of recuperating that humanism, of saying when you write about the world, or you write about someone moving through the world, you're telling a story that's of interest to everyone, not just representative of one specific experience, but that everyone can access.
So we'll take one last question back here.
Just a small point and then a larger question. In the history of Japanese literature, I don't know if Murakami refers to it, but this strategy of translating your work first from Japanese into another language and then translating it back into Japanese, in order to be free of Japanese literary tradition, is a very tried and true one. So that what's considered the first real Japanese modern novel, Futabate Shime's Floating Cloud or Drifting Cloud, he was fluent in Russian. In fact, he was at the war front at the Russo-Japanese War. He translated his work into Russian and then translated it back into Japanese. And this is like maybe late 1890s.
Oh.
And so I wonder about this question of whether the novel is meant to be it may not be representative of a nation, but that's different from saying that it's not part of nation building. Okay, so in the question of modernism, there are all sorts of, whether it's, for example, something like surrealism, which would not try to wouldn't be easily characterized as a nationalist style or type of literature. There's many countries around the world that once they proved they had a great surrealist writer, that engendered nationalist pride. It's like, we too are modern, or we too are surreal. We too have our own great surrealist writer. And when you look at the great era of the novel, the 19th, what's often considered the great era of the novel, 19th century, so many countries did see the novel as part of nation building. It was part of the necessary education of becoming a modern nation. And that wasn't only in Asia, but in Europe as well. I always admire the Japanese for having sent their two best literature students to England in the late 1890s in order to learn the British novel, because they thought the British novel, and then come home and write Japanese versions of the British novel, because they felt that the British novel had been indispensable to the building of British character and its colonial mentality, which they considered superior to German colonialism and French colonialism. And then, whether it's representative or not, I wonder if it's really a very provisional, conditional question, because if one accept, I mean, I don't know if you do accept, but if you accept that Balzac or Tolstoy were global novelists, and I think they were, because they were dealing with universalist debates and that had impact on world-changing eras, right?
Yeah.
And their characters are from many different nations, and there's slavery in Balzac, and there's obviously in Russia. Those seem to have ambitions to represent, not only on a national, to be representative not only on a national scale, but on a global scale. That they have the comprehensive picture of the world. I'm sorry if I'm not.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're definitely right about the 19th century novel, and
Which I do think, would you view those as global novels?
I don't know if it's quite the same, global in quite the same way. I think that one thing that Pascal Casanova writes about is the idea that literature takes its cues from this center, which is Western Europe, and that in order to what's innovative in Western Europe becomes derivative as it travels to other places. And this is a debate that in the 19th century happened about Russian literature, right? I mean, that was the sort of other place where the novel was being adapted. And so she writes about how in order to gain an international hearing and sort of the respect of the most advanced literary centers, a novel has to break out of its nationalism, that a national novel, a novel that's important nationally, is precisely a novel that won't become global because it seems like it belongs to an antiquated way of writing, to this 19th century mode. So she talks about Joyce as an example, that Joyce is writing about Ireland, and that in order to get people to listen to a novel about Ireland, you have to write it in a way that's radically new and breaks with tradition, and so that it becomes ultramodern. And she talks about Kafka as another example, that Kafka, coming from a sort of place that most Western Europeans didn't think about or know anything about, from Bohemia, had to write something radically modern in order to become part of this international conversation. So it could be that those two impulses go in opposite directions.
All right, well, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you guys so much for your conversation. Adam's new book is called The Global Novel. If you don't already have a copy, we have plenty in the back.